My son was dying, and there was nothing I could do to help or save him. When I heard the child whom I had dutifully raised to fear and revere God cry out in pain, asking why God had forsaken him, I wanted to scream. I had asked that question of God 1,000 times already. My son had tried to prepare me for this day. But what mother is ever prepared to witness her child's death? No mother wants to live that long. I certainly didn't. Even though he had warned me many times that he would die at the hands of men, I secretly prayed that for once he would be mistaken. But he was not. Even though there was a side of me that understood it had to be this way, that this was the purpose for which he'd come into the world, that he had to die in order to live again, that this was the will of the Creator, still I resented him and the Creator for torturing me this way. Why did my son have to die? I didn't care about the lives he was saving by dying. I didn't want him to die. I wanted him to come down and prove that he was not a fraud, not deranged, not a religious fanatic, and not a blasphemer. I wanted him to do something, anything, but die like a common criminal. As his mother, I wanted to urge him to do something. But I kept silent. I'd known for some time that this day was coming. Among the women huddling a few feet from him were my sister, who wept with her eyes closed, refusing to look at his feeble pose. Salome, who muttered and prayed unintelligibly as she dabbed her eyes with the hem of her veil. Mary of Magdala, who knelt on the ground sobbing, her eyes transfixed on the nails in his feet, and the others who variously cried and collapsed. I, however, stood silently by, neither weeping nor wailing. Mine were dry tears. The man hanging on the cross in the hot afternoon sun was not my nephew, not just the Messiah, not simply a friend. He was my son, my firstborn, and I stood there at the foot of his cross, powerless, aghast, staring up at my child. His features were almost indistinguishable for the blood issuing from his temples, the expression of agony on his face, and the scourge marks across his body. I couldn't see his eyes for the blood. The only time I felt my body go limp was when I heard the executioner's hammer. Resting his knee on the inside of my son's forearm, I watched him probe my son's wrist to find the hollow spot. When he raised his hammer over the nail head and brought it down with force, I could hear the wails of the women throughout the crowd, but none of them could match my son's outcry, nor the one in my head. Some of those whom I recognized as his followers turned their heads. Some buried their faces. Others walked away. I clutched my collar with one hand and beat my chest with the other. A jolt of pain tore through me. Right then the words of a just man in Jerusalem from years ago, when Joseph and I had presented our son for circumcision, came to my mind. And a sword will pierce your soul too. I looked up in time to see the soldiers lifting the crossbeam with my son's writhing body onto the upright beam. The tormented expression on his face shredded my insides. When the beams were secured, the next part of the ritual was begun, nailing the feet in place. It had to be done just so. His feet had to be pushed upward on the cross to prevent the kind of rapid draining of the blood that would occur if had his feet been nailed straight. One of his disciples tried to bury my face in his chest to protect me, but I pushed his hand gently away. I could not cry, but I promised myself that I would look. I didn't cry so I could see my son dying. Death, I understand. God knows I've buried my share of family and friends. It is the act and agony of dying that I find the hardest to witness, especially when the one dying is your child. Having to watch the accelerated decay of your child's body before your eyes is torment. Your eyes fix on portions of his decaying body that you remember were once soft folds of baby flesh. Before you now is a body that is frail and contorted, too fragile to caress. But you remember when the feel of him at your breast made you pull him close, not wanting to let go. Dying, as far as I'm concerned, is death's cruel sense of humor. His swollen face rested on his left shoulder. This meant that the thorns the soldiers had just placed on his head had pierced both his temples and his shoulder. His arms were stretched above his head in the shape of a V. Blood and sweat streamed down his body. A large blob of both gathered in the thick, coarse beard that I'd always admired. His breathing was weak. His chest barely moved. From the waist down, he appeared lifeless. His feet were unrecognizable. The swelling had begun to swallow the 5-inch nail. His body looked like a withering, gnarled vine against the backdrop of the cypress beam that held his body. Even though I had tried to prepare myself for this day, still, when the time came, I wasn't ready. The sight of his barely clad frame dragging through the streets, the 30-pound crossbeam across his body, lacerated right shoulder, had been difficult to witness. I wanted to cover his body with my own. All around me and the disciple who stood by me, crowds pressed about, shaking their heads, gawking, jeering, asking questions. Children asked their parents what death was. Adults asked each other what the 3 had done to deserve death. And pilgrims who were en route to Jerusalem to observe the Sabbath looked away in disgust, not wanting to see the Romans put Jews to death. When the procession reached Golgotha, where 3 upright cypress beams stood for just such occasions, a hush fell over everyone. The hill smelled of death. I clasped the disciple's hand. Over the last several months, I had found out everything I could about the Roman custom of execution. I had thought I could prepare myself. But there is no way for a mother to prepare for her child's death. Not for his death, and certainly not for his dying. You can't prepare. You can only witness and watch a part of you die with him. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my husband Joseph, standing off a distance with a pained expression on his face. He had refused to come with me when word had come that our son had been taken before the tribunal. He faked being busy in his shop. There had always been a gentle awkwardness between the two, but from where I stood, I could tell that the sight of the mutilated body Joseph had once bathed in cool cloths was more than he too could bear. He did not look in my direction. I always felt that he somehow blamed me for the fact that his child, who, though well-mannered and respectful, never quite regarded him as a father. Before he turned and walked away, Joseph too wept. While everyone else wept, I looked on and remembered. When my son was a newborn in my arms, he would look up at me with trusting, innocent, eager eyes that always seemed to be asking questions of me for which I had no answers. My only way of answering him was to hold him tightly in my arms and pray that I would always be able to protect him. I wanted to hold him and never let him go. Even then, I knew that one day he would break my heart. In truth, life with him was always life without him. He never really belonged to me. Even his conception was shrouded in mystery. My pregnancy had created quite a stir in the village where I lived. Some said I had been raped. Some said that I'd been immoral. Some called me an outright liar when I spoke to them about angels and visions and voices. There were times when I myself didn't know what to believe. It had all happened so quickly. I felt like I was anything but a woman who was blessed among women. I didn't want to bear the Christ. I wanted to have a son. It almost cost me Joseph. Although my husband eventually believed me, I felt he never quite forgave me. The truth is, while Jesus was my son, he was never quite my child. He never really belonged to me. But when he was born, I understood why mothers die for their sons. A son is a mother's obsession in a way a daughter never is. For he is the first male love that is lavished upon her without her asking. She neither has to compete for it or earn it. Her father's love and attention are always complicated by her mother's presence. Her brother's love is always compromised by her mother and siblings, and her husband's love is rarely unconditional. For a time, her son's love is the only male love for which she doesn't have to compete, doesn't have to seduce, doesn't have to earn. An infant son touches his mother but does not coerce her. He loves her but cannot possess her. For the first time in her life, she controls the way she is loved by a male. For the first time, she can fashion the way she wants to be loved. He is a part of her, but he is not like her, which makes his every impulse bewitching. His maleness fascinates her. His difference arouses her. He is her son. He is a stranger, and he loves her. The combination is arresting. And no matter how old he becomes, no matter where he goes, she can always be satisfied to know that she, his mother, was his first love. There were times when I resented the life my son had chosen. He was never home for the holidays, and he never remembered my birthday. His ministry was first. In fact, it was the only thing in his life. He gave me no grandchildren. He slept wherever he could lay his head, I'm told. And even though he didn't have to, he ate whatever he could. He could always come home, but he never chose to. I accepted that, sort of. He was never mine, and he was always just a trot away from peril. He lived under constant threat to his life. But so did we, his family. It started as far back as the time when he was born. Even then, Joseph and I had to flee to Egypt to save his life. But the threat of death never seemed to faze him. Why didn't he ever think about his family? The toil that his lifestyle took on us, the ridicule, the stares, the interrogations, the rumors, the threats, the ostracism. It seemed that everywhere my son went, he made more enemies than converts. Even our neighbors in Nazareth doubted his ministry. They took no pride in their native son. Even after his first sermon taken from the scroll of Isaiah, I overheard the old men asking one another, "Wasn't that Joseph's son?" They could not understand how, nor were they willing to believe that a carpenter's son could be so learned in the matters of the law and the prophets as he had proven to be. The fact that he spoke with such authority seemed to irritate them. My son left home that day, and he never returned to Nazareth, to his family, to his home. Not really. It was ironic that the one who went about bringing healing and hope to other families would remain for the most part estranged from his own. Imagine the insult when on one of the few occasions I, along with his sisters and brothers, tried to see him. He sent word back asking who his mother was. I was shocked and hurt. Who did he think he was? Busy or not, ordained or not, that was no way to talk to his mother. I bit my tongue, regained my poise, and walked away. After all I'd done for him, I'd washed his butt when he didn't know he had one. I'd sucked the phlegm from his nostrils when he couldn't breathe. I'd stayed up all night when he'd been sick with fever. I'd taught him to read. I'd prayed for him when he couldn't pray for himself. I'd been the one who encouraged him to perform his first miracle by turning the jars of water into wine. Not that he owed me anything, but he could have shown some respect. Had he gotten too big to come and see about his own people? The soldiers' laughter brought me back to the cross. Some were kneeling at his feet gambling. Others were taunting him. Someone had placed a sign over his head that read, "The King of the Jews." Finally, my son lifted his head and looked in my direction. I moved closer. I wanted him to see that I was there, powerless, lost, tormented and empty, but there. His voice was faint. The only word I could make out was woman. I thought I would buckle under the sound of his voice. Tears welled in my eyes, but I fought them back. I wanted to see my son. I felt my head whirling. Didn't he recognize me? Woman. Woman. His words tore at my heart. Why couldn't he call me mother? Why, even in death, was he keeping his distance? I could feel the disciple's arm tighten around me. It was as though my son were giving me away to a stranger. I was his mother. Did that mean anything to him? Didn't he remember? Why couldn't he call me mother? I needed him to call me mother one more time before it was over. Say it. Say it, I screamed in my head. I needed to hear him call out to me. Thinking back on it, perhaps, just perhaps, had he allowed himself to think of me as his mother, he might have come down from that cross. Perhaps he knew that in the end I needed a savior more than I needed a son. In the distance, I heard the crack of thunder as his body sagged one last time into the shape of a V. I knew then that it was time to let my beloved son go. And so I did. But first,